She's lucky I kept her. That was the sentence my husband Richard chose to say about me while standing on a stage under bright ballroom lights, holding a glass of champagne and smiling like the hero of the evening. The crowd laughed politely, the kind of laughter people give when they assume a joke must be funny because the man telling it owns the company sponsoring the event. I remember the sound of the room more than anything else. Silverware against porcelain plates. A violinist playing something soft near the back of the hall. And the quiet echo of my own heartbeat as I sat at table 14. Hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not react. Not because the words didn't sting. They did. But after 40 years of marriage, you learn something about humiliation. The loudest response is often silence. The charity gala was being held at the Grand Harbor Ballroom downtown. A place with crystal chandeliers the size of pickup trucks and windows tall enough to show the city skyline glowing like a field of stars. Richard loved rooms like that. Rooms where people listen when he spoke. Rooms where everyone forgot how small he used to be. When we first married, he didn't own a tuxedo. He barely owned a reliable car. I still remember the night he came home with the idea for his first company written on a yellow legal pad. His hands shaking slightly as he explained it across our kitchen table. Back then our house was 900 square feet, and the refrigerator made a clicking sound every 10 minutes. I listened. I believed him. I sold my little flower shop 2 months later so he could have the startup money. None of that was mentioned tonight. Instead, Richard stood under the spotlight like a king telling stories about his rise. People leaned forward in their chairs. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, laughed especially loudly at his jokes. She sat near the stage beside my son Daniel, both of them dressed in expensive black formal wear that probably cost more than the mortgage payment we once struggled to make in 1989. Melissa had a habit of squeezing Daniel's arm every time Richard made a comment about how hard he had worked to build everything from nothing. From nothing. I suppose that version of the story is easier to tell. Across the ballroom, waiters moved. Between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and glasses of California Pinot Noir. A soft golden light reflected off the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of roses from the centerpieces. It was the kind of elegant evening people take photographs of and frame on their walls. Richard lifted the microphone again, smiling wider now that the crowd seemed comfortable with him. My wife Eleanor, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the tables somewhere in my direction. Well, she's lucky I kept her around through all those crazy early years. Another ripple of laughter moved across the room. I lowered my eyes to the white linen tablecloth. For a moment I watched the flame of the candle flicker in the glass holder beside my plate. It burned quietly. Steady. Then something unexpected happened. A chair scraped across the marble floor near the front of the room. The sound cut through the laughter like a line drawn across paper. I looked up. A tall man at the VIP table was standing. Every head slowly turned toward him. Even Richard stopped smiling. Because the man walking toward the stage was Jonathan Hale. And in our city, when Jonathan Hale stands up, people stop talking. Jonathan Hale did not hurry when he walked toward the stage. Men like him never needed to. The room seemed to shift around his movement the way water moves around the bow of a large ship. Conversations stopped. Forks paused halfway to plates. Even the violinist near the back lowered her bow for a moment as people began whispering his name under their breath. Jonathan Hale was not just wealthy. In our city, he was the kind of man whose decisions quietly changed the direction of entire industries. I had not seen him in person for nearly 20 years. Yet the moment I recognized the tall frame and the calm way he carried himself, a strange memory brushed against the back of my mind like a page from an old book turning by itself. On the stage, Richard shifted his weight slightly, still holding the microphone but no longer smiling the way he had 30 seconds earlier. Melissa leaned toward Daniel and whispered something that made my son frown in confusion. No one had expected this interruption. Jonathan reached the steps of the stage and climbed them slowly, his polished shoes making a soft sound against the wood. The ballroom lights reflected off the silver in his hair. When he arrived beside Richard, he did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked out across the audience for a moment, as if measuring the room, then gently placed one hand on the microphone. Richard hesitated before letting go of it. That hesitation lasted less than a second, but everyone noticed. Jonathan brought the microphone closer and his voice carried easily through the speakers, calm and steady. He said that he hoped he was not interrupting the celebration, but that he had heard a comment a moment ago that deserved a little clarification. A soft ripple of curiosity moved across the room. People leaned forward in their chairs. Jonathan turned his head slightly toward Richard and said that jokes about loyalty can sometimes sound amusing until the truth behind them is forgotten. Richard attempted a polite laugh and replied that he had only been teasing his wife. The word wife floated through the ballroom like a thin piece of glass. Jonathan nodded slowly as if he had expected that answer. Then he looked out across the tables again and asked a simple question. He asked where Eleanor Whitmore was sitting tonight. For a moment no one moved. I felt several heads turn in my direction. Table 14 suddenly seemed brighter than the rest of the room. Melissa looked back toward me with raised eyebrows as if she had only just remembered that I existed. Daniel followed her gaze and gave a small uncertain wave. Jonathan spotted me almost immediately. His eyes rested on me for a second longer than polite conversation usually requires, and something like recognition flickered there. He lifted the microphone again and said that it had been a very long time since he had seen me. The room grew even quieter. Richard's smile had completely disappeared now. I remained seated, my hands still folded in my lap, listening carefully because I had the distinct feeling that the evening we had all expected was about to become something entirely different. I did not stand when Jonathan Hale said my name. I simply looked up at the stage and met his eyes across the sea of round tables, glassware, and quiet curiosity. For a moment the room seemed to shrink, as if the hundreds of people in that ballroom had become distant figures watching something private unfold between two people who shared a memory no one else understood. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, studying me the way someone studies a photograph they have not seen in years. Then he smiled, not widely, but with the calm certainty of a man who had just confirmed something important. He said that he had hoped it was really me sitting there tonight because he had been listening to the speech on stage and felt that part of the story was missing. A faint ripple of laughter moved through the room, but it faded quickly because no one was quite sure whether they were supposed to laugh. Richard shifted beside him and attempted to recover the atmosphere. He said that the evening was meant to celebrate the company's growth and the generosity of everyone attending the charity event. Jonathan nodded politely, but he did not step away from the microphone. Instead he asked Richard a simple question. He asked whether Richard remembered the year 1989. My husband blinked, clearly surprised by the direction of the conversation. He said that he remembered many years, but that 1989 had been the beginning of everything for his business. Jonathan smiled slightly and said that was exactly what he thought. Then he looked back toward me again, and this time several people at nearby tables turned their chairs so they could see my face more clearly. I kept my posture the same, my hand still resting lightly on the tablecloth beside the candle. Jonathan continued speaking in the same calm voice. He said that 1989 had also been the year when a small investor wrote a check that changed the future of two different men in that room. A murmur spread slowly through the audience. Melissa leaned forward in her chair, clearly trying to understand where this story was going. Daniel looked confused, glancing between his father and the man holding the microphone. Jonathan explained that the investment had not come from a bank or a venture capital firm. It had come from someone who believed in a quiet idea scribbled on paper at a kitchen table. Someone who sold something valuable to make that belief possible. I felt my chest rise slowly with a breath I had not realized I was holding. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the crystal glasses around me, and for a brief moment I remembered the smell of fresh flowers from my old shop and the weight of the keys I had handed to the new owner the day I sold it. On the stage Richard's expression had changed. He was no longer amused. He was no longer relaxed. Jonathan lifted the microphone a little closer and said that he would like to ask the audience a small question before the evening continued. He asked whether anyone in the room knew who had written the very first check that allowed Richard Whitmore to start his company. Silence settled over the ballroom like a blanket. Then Jonathan turned his gaze toward table 14 again, and said that the answer was sitting quietly right there. For several seconds no one in the ballroom spoke. The silence did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the moment before a storm when the air presses down on everything. I could feel dozens of eyes turning toward table 14, searching for the woman Jonathan Hale had just pointed to without pointing. Melissa slowly twisted in her chair to look directly at me now, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper, something closer to disbelief. Daniel followed her gaze again, and this time he did not wave. He simply stared as if trying to place a piece of information that had never existed in his version of our family story. On the stage, Richard stood very still beside Jonathan, his shoulders slightly tense beneath the tailored jacket he had chosen so carefully for tonight. The bright chandelier light above the stage caught the side of his face, and I noticed something I had not seen in years: uncertainty. Jonathan allowed the quiet to stretch just long enough for the room to absorb his question. Then he spoke again in that same steady tone that carried easily across the ballroom. He said that the check written in 1989 had not been large by the standards of investors in this room tonight. It had been $25,000. A few people nodded politely at the number, but Jonathan raised one finger slightly as if reminding them that context mattered. He explained that in 1989 $25,000 represented something different for a young couple living in a small house with a refrigerator that hummed too loudly at night, and a kitchen table that doubled as an office desk. A few soft murmurs moved through the audience as people began piecing together the direction of the story. Jonathan continued and said that the woman who wrote that check had not been an investor looking for profit. She had been someone who believed in possibility, someone who sold a small business she loved, because she believed in the dream of the man sitting beside him on stage. At the word business, my memory sharpened again. I could almost feel the cool metal of the shop keys in my palm, and smell the mixture of roses and lilies that used to fill the air every morning before sunrise. Across the room, Melissa blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process what she was hearing. I had heard her say many times that Richard had built everything alone. She had repeated that story so often that even Daniel had started to believe it. Jonathan finally turned his head toward Richard, and asked him gently whether he would like to tell the audience who that first investor had been. Richard opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. For a brief second, the confident man who loved speaking on stages looked like someone searching for an exit that did not exist. Jonathan did not press him. Instead, he lifted the microphone again and answered the question himself. He said that the woman who made that sacrifice was Eleanor Whitmore. The room inhaled as one. And for the first time that evening, I slowly unfolded my hands from my lap and looked up at the stage, knowing the story was no longer something Richard could rewrite. The sound that followed Jonathan Hale speaking my name was not loud, but it traveled through the ballroom like a ripple across water. People shifted in their chairs. Someone near the back whispered something that made another person lean closer to hear. The elegant room that had been full of confident laughter only minutes earlier now felt uncertain, like a stage where the script had suddenly changed without warning. I remained seated at table 14, my hands now resting calmly beside the candle that flickered in its glass holder. For years I had grown used to being invisible in rooms like this, the quiet wife who smiled politely while others spoke about achievements and success. Tonight, however, invisibility had disappeared the moment Jonathan Hale said my name out loud. On the stage, Richard looked toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen for a long time. It was not anger. It was something closer to discomfort, the kind that appears when a carefully practiced story begins to fall apart. Jonathan waited a moment before continuing. He did not rush the moment, and I understood why. Truth, when spoken slowly, has a way of settling into a room more deeply than any speech filled with excitement. He explained to the audience that the $25,000 check written in 1989 had not simply been an act of encouragement between a husband and wife. It had been the entire foundation on which two different futures were built. Some people in the crowd began nodding now as if they were starting to see the shape of the story forming. Jonathan then added something that caused several heads to turn again. He said that the small investment made by Eleanor Whitmore had not only helped Richard start his company, it had also helped another young man who had once been sitting at that same kitchen table with nothing more than a sketch of an idea and an uncertain future. The audience grew quieter again as he spoke those words. Melissa looked from Jonathan to Richard, and then back toward me with an expression that suggested she was hearing a family history she had never been told. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his brows drawn together as if he were trying to reconstruct years of conversations that suddenly felt incomplete. Jonathan continued speaking in that same calm voice and explained that many people believe success came from bold speeches, and confident leaders standing under bright lights. But in his experience, the real beginnings of great things usually came from someone quiet who believed in an idea before the world noticed it. He paused again, letting the room absorb the meaning behind the statement. Then he looked directly toward my table and said that before Richard Whitmore ever had a boardroom, before he ever had investors or executives, there had been a woman who trusted him enough to risk everything she owned. The words seemed to settle over the room like a gentle but undeniable truth. I could see people now turning their attention fully toward me, not with pity or curiosity, but with something closer to recognition. And for the first time in many years I realized that the story everyone believed about our beginning was no longer the only story in the room. The atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely now. The same people who had been laughing comfortably earlier were sitting straighter in their chairs, watching the stage with a kind of careful attention that only appears when a story begins revealing pieces no one expected to hear. Jonathan Hale did not raise his voice, and he did not hurry his words. He simply continued speaking with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. He said that many people in the room admired success because they saw the finished version of it, the polished version that stood under chandeliers and gave speeches at charity events. But very few people ever saw the fragile beginning. The moment when an idea existed only as ink on paper and hope in someone's voice. As he spoke, I felt old memories returning with surprising clarity. The narrow kitchen in our first house. The worn wooden chair where Richard used to sit late at night, staring at numbers and sketches that barely made sense to anyone but him. The quiet promise I had made to myself that I would believe in that dream even if no one else did. Jonathan explained that the check written in 1989 had not been the only moment when Eleanor Whitmore changed the direction of someone's life. He paused again, letting the audience lean forward just slightly before continuing. He said that in those early days Richard had not been the only young man struggling to turn an idea into something real. There had been another visitor at that kitchen table, someone who arrived carrying a thin folder and more doubt than confidence. Several people in the audience exchanged curious looks as Jonathan spoke those words. Melissa had completely turned in her chair now, her eyes fixed on the stage with an intensity that suggested she did not like the direction this story was taking. Daniel remained very still beside her, his expression thoughtful, almost uneasy. Jonathan continued and said that the second young man had come looking for advice but had left that house with something far more valuable. He had left with encouragement and a small loan that had been offered quietly, without contracts or applause. The amount had been modest even by the standards of that time. $10,000 written on a personal check, and handed across the same kitchen table. Jonathan smiled slightly as he described the moment, and there was a warmth in his voice now that had not been there earlier. He explained that the woman who offered that help had not asked for recognition. She had simply said that sometimes the right idea only needs one person to believe in it long enough for the world to catch up. A murmur moved through the ballroom again, softer this time but filled with curiosity. Then Jonathan looked out over the crowd and said something that caused several people to shift in their seats. He said that the young man who received that quiet loan had eventually built a company of his own. A company that now employed thousands of people across the country. A company that, by coincidence, was the same one sponsoring the charity gala that everyone in the room had come to attend tonight. When he finished that sentence, the realization moved through the audience like a slow wave. People began looking from Jonathan Hale to me and back again, as if they were finally connecting pieces of a story that had remained hidden for decades. The realization moved through the ballroom slowly, like a quiet wind passing through tall grass. People were no longer whispering small guesses to each other. Now they were watching Jonathan Hale with the full attention normally reserved for moments when something important is about to be said. On the stage, Richard Whitmore stood very still beside him, his hands clasped lightly in front of him as though he had suddenly forgotten what he had planned to say next. Melissa had turned completely toward the stage now, her elegant smile gone, replaced by an expression that mixed confusion and discomfort. Daniel sat beside her without moving, his eyes shifting between his father, the man holding the microphone, and the table where I remained seated. Jonathan allowed the quiet to settle before continuing. He said that many people believed great fortunes were built only by ambition and intelligence, but in his experience the true beginning of success almost always involves someone who was willing to believe before success existed. He said that sometimes that person never received applause. Sometimes their name disappeared from the story entirely. Several guests in the audience nodded slowly as they listened, recognizing the truth hidden in those words. Jonathan then turned slightly toward Richard again, and said that the company being celebrated tonight had grown into something impressive, something that had created opportunity for many people in this city. Richard forced a small smile and nodded politely, but the tension in his posture had not disappeared. Jonathan then added something that caused another quiet ripple through the room. He said that success stories often become simplified over time. The details become smaller. The sacrifices become quieter. And eventually the original truth becomes almost invisible. He paused again and looked directly across the ballroom toward me. I met his gaze calmly, feeling the strange sensation of years folding together inside a single moment. Jonathan continued and said that when he first walked into our small kitchen in 1989, he had been younger than most of the interns working at his company today. He had arrived carrying a thin folder and a business plan that most investors would have dismissed in less than 5 minutes. He smiled slightly as he remembered the moment. He said that he still remembered the smell of fresh flowers coming from the back room of the house, and the sound of a coffee pot quietly brewing while 3 people sat around a worn wooden table discussing possibilities that did not yet exist. Several people in the ballroom leaned forward in their seats as if the picture he was describing had suddenly become very clear. Jonathan said that he had expected to receive advice that night. What he had not expected was trust. He explained that Eleanor Whitmore had listened patiently, while 2 nervous young men tried to explain ideas that sounded much larger than the reality they were living in. And at the end of that conversation she had done something that changed both of their futures. She had written 2 checks. One to her husband so he could begin building his company, and another to a young visitor who had barely believed in himself yet. Jonathan finally lifted the microphone slightly higher and said quietly that the second young man had been him. The room fell silent again. But this time the silence carried something different. It carried the unmistakable sound of a story being corrected in front of everyone who had believed the easier version for far too long. For a moment after Jonathan Hale said those words, the entire ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. The quiet that followed was deeper than any silence earlier that night, because now the truth was no longer a suggestion or a story. It was a fact spoken plainly in front of everyone who had come to celebrate success. I remained seated at table 14, the soft light of the candle reflecting against the rim of my glass, while dozens of eyes slowly shifted between the stage and the woman they had barely noticed before the evening began. Jonathan did not look proud when he revealed the truth. If anything, there was something reflective in his expression. The look of someone remembering a version of himself that had once been uncertain and hopeful. He said that he had carried that memory with him for more than 30 years. He said that people often asked him what the turning point of his career had been. Some expected him to mention a contract or a merger or a risky decision that paid off. But the real answer, he explained, had happened in a small kitchen where someone believed in an idea that had not yet proven itself. A quiet murmur moved through the audience again. But this time the tone was different. It was no longer curiosity. It was recognition. Several guests turned in their seats to look at me more carefully now, as if they were seeing a detail in a painting that had always been there but had somehow escaped attention. On the stage, Richard Whitmore remained silent. His shoulders were stiff, and the confident rhythm he normally carried during speeches had completely disappeared. Melissa sat very still beside Daniel now. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and discomfort. The version of our family story she had repeated so confidently for years had suddenly become incomplete in front of an entire room of witnesses. Jonathan continued speaking in the same calm voice that had held the attention of everyone present. He said that success often grows louder as it expands. Companies become larger. Buildings become taller. Celebrations become more elaborate. But the beginning of success is almost always quiet. It begins with someone willing to take a risk before the outcome is visible. He paused again and glanced briefly toward me before looking back at the audience. Then he said something that caused several people in the front rows to exchange surprised glances. He said that when Eleanor Whitmore wrote those 2 checks in 1989, she had not asked for anything in return. No contract. No guarantee. No public recognition. But he had insisted on something at the time. He had insisted that if his idea ever became real, the woman who believed in it would always remain part of that success whether she chose to speak about it or not. A ripple of quiet speculation moved through the room as people began wondering what he meant. Jonathan lifted the microphone slightly closer and explained that the promise he made that night had never been forgotten. In fact, it had been written into the earliest legal documents of the company he eventually built. When he finished that sentence, the audience leaned forward almost as one, because it was suddenly clear that the story everyone thought had reached its conclusion was only just beginning to reveal its final piece. The quiet expectation in the ballroom grew heavier after Jonathan Hale mentioned that promise. People were no longer simply listening to a surprising story. Now they were waiting for the final piece that would explain why one of the most influential men in the room had chosen this particular moment to speak. Jonathan let the silence settle naturally before continuing. His voice remained steady, calm, almost conversational, but every person in the audience seemed focused on each word. He said that many people believe success erased the past, but in his experience the past had a way of waiting patiently until the right moment to remind everyone where things truly began. He explained that the company he built had grown beyond anything he imagined when he first carried that thin folder into a stranger's kitchen. It now operated offices in several states and employed thousands of people across the country. The charity gala being held tonight was just one of many events the company sponsored each year. But long before the first building was purchased or the first board meeting was held, a document had been written. It had been signed quietly in a small law office during the earliest days of the company's formation. Jonathan paused and looked out across the room again. Then he said that the document included a clause that very few people outside his legal team had ever noticed. It stated that 5% of the company's founding equity would permanently belong to the woman who had believed in the idea before it had a name. A ripple of stunned whispers moved through the ballroom, louder this time, because even those who did not work in business understood what that meant. Jonathan continued calmly and explained that over the decades, his company had expanded far beyond that original vision. Today its estimated value was measured in the billions of dollars, which meant that the quiet promise he made more than 30 years earlier had grown into something far larger than the small check that started it. At table 14 I sat perfectly still, feeling dozens of eyes turning toward me again. Some expressions carried surprise. Others carried admiration. A few carried the awkward realization that they had overlooked someone standing quietly beside the story for a very long time. On the stage, Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze slightly, the confident humor he once carried completely gone now. Melissa's posture had stiffened, her earlier certainty replaced by a tight silence. Daniel looked thoughtful, as though he had just discovered that the foundation of his family's story was different from what he had always believed. Jonathan finally turned his head toward me again and spoke with a gentler tone. He said that promises made in quiet moments should still be honored when success becomes loud. Then he invited Eleanor Whitmore to join him on the stage, explaining to the audience that the woman many of them had overlooked tonight was not simply the wife of a successful businessman. She was one of the earliest believers in two companies that now shaped the lives of thousands of people. As the room slowly filled with applause that began uncertainly but grew stronger with each passing second, it became clear that the story everyone thought they understood had just been rewritten in front of them.